Once around the park, James, and don't spare the horses.
Well, to all of you listening in, happy Coronaversary. This is March the 11th, 2022. 2 years ago today, our lives changed. It's when they declared the pandemic. So, and it's kind of nice to be able to say we're looking at sort of the rear view mirror of the pandemic. It's, nobody wants to say it's over because it ain't. But we thought we'd mark it just in terms of the change in attitude. Maybe we'll get into some of that today. So on the ledge, Dave Trafford here. It's the Ontario Politics Podcast, along with our usual suspects. Keith Leslie joining us from our Nova Scotia Bureau. John Wright is here, and Sabrina Nanji, the editor and founder of the Queen's Park Observer. So, when we look at this, I think just in the news today, Sabrina, the whole conversation around the school boards and masks. I said this morning, 2 years ago, we were saying, masks? Why do we need masks? We don't need no stinking masks. Today, it's masks. Why are we taking the masks off? We need those stinking masks. So, it's almost as if that's sort of the flip side of the coin in terms of that's how much the behavior has changed. But if that's the biggest issue we're going to have to deal with as far as the schools are concerned, whether the kids are wearing masks or not, I think we're in a pretty good place.
Yeah, we've come a long way, and the timing, it's just, as a quick aside, it's like a week of anniversaries, like the anniversary of Doug Ford becoming PC leader in 2018. Steven Del Duca is earlier on March 7th, becoming leader of the Liberal Party in 2020. So it feels like, I don't know, all these things coming together at this time and where we're at. But the masks is kind of a bit complicated for me, especially in schools, because I think we're going to get into like a little bit of the weeds here when it comes to jurisdiction. We've got some school boards saying we're going to ask permission of the province to keep these masks in place for a little bit longer. We've got experts like CHEO Hospital and Sick Kids saying we should have kept masking in place for 2 more weeks after March break. A lot of families are going to be going away on vacation. Why schools have been, relatively safe. So why mess with a good thing right now? And so we might be seeing some folks asking the top doc here and more about, if they can keep that in place. We've kind of seen Toronto District School Board and Hamilton go in that direction. But I think there's a lot to be positive about right now. Hopefully the weather's getting better too. There's going to be a lot of things outdoors. Baseball is back. And we have an end date for COVID restrictions, and end of April, a few days before the official start of the campaign. I'm kind of seeing all of this with a bit of a political lens, but I think, you're right. Like silver linings, many silver linings here, a lot to be feeling positive about. And that's definitely what the Ford government wants the electorate to be feeling like before they're heading into the campaign, which is just around the corner.
Well, we treat this as if it's only happening here in Ontario, Keith. And, I know that Nova Scotia, Atlantic Canada was lauded early on, particularly because of their ability to contain it. They were really good at contact tracing, all that kind of stuff. We went to visit back in 2020 in the summer, had to quarantine for 2 weeks before we could go and visit the kids. So was it rigorous? Yeah. Was it a pain? For sure. But we kind of have this view in Ontario that, oh my, we're inventing the wheel as we go along, as opposed to looking at other jurisdictions and saying, it's okay, they're doing it there. I mean, BC just dropped their masks. So these sort of arbitrary numbers that we start throwing around, or dates we start throwing around, if you get outside of the province, why are we doing it now?
Well, as you say, reinventing the wheel, I got a chuckle out of the health minister, Ms. Elliott, saying the other day that, Ontario's in good shape. We have lots of these rapid tests available everywhere now. Well, Ontario sat on them for like 18 months. You talked about Nova Scotia. They jumped on those rapid tests right away, early on, and found they discovered something like 20% of their active cases through these rapid tests. It was absolutely effective. So reinventing the wheel. But as you said, looking around the world, especially south of the border here. We're seeing the mandates come off. Nova Scotia is going to lift its school mask mandates the same date as Ontario. Other provinces are ahead. There'll be a couple behind, obviously. It seems the time. What does seem unfortunate is that schools that want to keep it, and we're talking to the largest school boards, I'm sure some of the others do as well, having to ask permission of their public health unit, and then that public health unit having to ask permission of the chief medical officer of health for the schools just to keep the mask mandate. Now, I thought it was kind of flip of the education minister to say, well, when they first come back from spring break, which is when the mask mandates will come off, well, the kids, if they're flying back from somewhere, they'll have to get tested to do the flights. Well, really? That takes care of that group. But what about the rest that aren't flying around the world, but still maybe, it just seems, especially after a week of what we assume would be a lot of socializing by kids who haven't been able to socialize for these past 2 years, maybe keeping the masks on for another couple of weeks really wouldn't be a bad idea after the spring break. So that seems a bit unfortunate that Ontario's putting all this bureaucracy, I guess, in place to stop school boards from just saying, no, we're going to keep it for a while. We've said everyone else can keep it. Businesses are entitled to keep it if they want or not. Now, the other side of this coin is we haven't seen what we've seen in the United States, where school boards have become the battleground, where people are just losing their nut and going absolutely crazy or beating up principals over mask mandates in schools. So I don't think Canada is anywhere near that level, and I don't think it'll get there. But I think schools should be allowed, or school boards should be allowed to make the decisions for themselves whether they want to keep the mask for another couple of weeks after spring break.
Well, John, it just gets to the question that seems a perennial question. Why do we have school boards, by the way?
Yeah.
I mean, if they can't run the freaking schools, and this is just one example where they kind of have to go cap in hand to Queen's Park and ask permission to do something that they should be doing anyway.
Well, I guess being an elected position, they're going to have their own constituents who are going to be lobbying them to keep the masks either on or off. So it's a political thing, and they got to toss it up somewhere to, show that they're doing something about it. It seems a bit odd given the fact that the local health authority still has that authority to impose certain things. I would think it would be this. But I think there's another part to this that I'm really surprised the politicians haven't been playing up, and that is wearing a mask now is a matter of choice. There shouldn't be a stigma as to whether or not you're wearing one or not. And I can understand that, little Jimmy or Janie, might be stigmatized in their school if they're wearing a mask, but the reality is that about a third of the public in this country is not ready for taking the mask off anywhere. About a third of the country is. And then a third gives some conditions around it. So the politicians may be putting up this mission accomplished banner. I'm not really sure that the public is, I know they're not, that's my job. They're not with them at the moment. But I've been kind of surprised that the politicians haven't said, it really is a matter of choice and discretion in our own society that if you don't feel comfortable, and I'll give you one example. I mean, our daughter, Olivia, as this panel knows, has been working from home for the last virtually 2 years. She's at Queen's University, and, they've just started back into in-class circumstances. Okay, so she goes down on once a week, and she stays over and then comes back on a Monday night. After doing her day of classes, and does the rest from here. Well, guess what happened on Wednesday? One of the girls that she was with found out that she tested positive. And all the girls now that they were out because they'd had this kind of reunion dinner where they all got together, and then all of a sudden it's in our house. Maybe so. Crack open the test, and it's on the. It had no semblance of her having COVID at the moment. But again, it's one of those weird things where you think you're out of the woods, you're not. If you've got an underlying health condition, it's a challenge. And I really do think, it comes down to one of those individual things. I think there are going to be some people who just don't stop wearing masks for another year or more, maybe. But I think that it has to be promoted as a choice as opposed to anything else.
Yeah, well, and I think at that stage, when you get back to the office, that's on the whole issue about, where Canadians are split on whether they want to go back full time, et cetera. And whether you wear the mask. So what does it say, and what kind of complication does it add into the culture, Sabrina, if you decide you're going to wear a mask, but Keith isn't wearing his? So is that disrespecting you, or are you respecting? I mean, we get into this real HR conundrum all of a sudden, which to me seems unnecessary, but I guarantee it's going to happen.
Yeah, I think tensions are definitely going to be running high, but I think that, it's important to look to the advice right now, even though it is going to be up to us. But we did hear, the top doctor say he's going to continue to wear a mask in crowded spaces. So I do think, to everyone's point here that, yeah, like they might stick around for a while. And you're right that we're kind of in a different place right now too, whereas like it's kind of in the beginning stages of the pandemic, wearing a mask was more from people that had symptoms maybe, and now it's about protecting yourself as well as others. So I think that leaving it up to individuals, that's a good move. Obviously, like they're not banned, the masks, of course, but I think they will be a lasting relic of this pandemic. I mean, if nothing else, I'm kind of tired of seeing them as litter, like trash on the sidewalks and everything. But I do think masks will be around for a lot longer.
Yesterday, I guess it was yesterday, it sounded to me like the premier had pulled out almost every map, transit and transportation map, Keith, that he possibly could get his hands on. And we just did an overlay and made it sound as if this was like some big new idea that we were pitching here to the province. Big money. It was like $82 billion. $82 billion. And when you looked at it, I mean, there are things that are already in the works, Ontario line, et cetera. I hate to sound cynical, but I mean, I said this morning, I think we've probably spent $82 billion on transit maps over the last 50 years. And that's as far as we've gotten in some cases. Slow burn. It's an easy thing. But if we go back to some of the promises made already in the last mandate, we're not even close to getting, anywhere near what was promised by the incoming Ford government. So how much is this going to play? Because 413 is going to be a kind of a spur in his saddle, I think, in terms of getting down the road, because that's going to be a tough one to sell, or it's going to be an easy one to shoot at. Let's put it that way. Well,
I don't think he sees it that way. I think he sees it as coming to the rescue of these poor suburban people who are trapped in their cars. And this plan, this is what this is all about. This is right on Ford message mandate, right? Let's get right to it. Highways. I think about 20 billion of this was highways. The other 60 billion was transit systems. As you say, I don't know how many backs of envelopes were used here, but there was an awful lot of drawers pulled open and plans pulled out. And we're going to loop the Ontario line into something that'll hook up with Pearson Airport. Well, it sounds like a decent idea. Finally, to have rapid transit to Pearson, all these sorts of things. It's all great ideas, great election, but it's such pie in the sky. First of all, almost all of it is going to that hasn't already started. Depends on federal funding coming in, on all sorts of approvals, let alone the environmental assessments and approvals. This is really just positioning for the election. I mean, we're down to less than 60 days till the election, and here's Ford going on the same thing. It's the tolls, it's the removing your license renewal fees, it's all these things aimed at motorists, which is the heart of Ford Nation. Remember when he talked about taking away the license fees? He talked about saving most families $240 because he views everybody as a two-car family, not a no-car family where this doesn't help at all. So I think this is exactly who he's appealing to here. But it's also, there's a lot of common sense to the fact Ontario desperately is in need of more transit, and in a lot of parts of the province, not just the GTA. It needs more and better transit, and highways are part of that. So I think it's on brand for them, but I think it's also very much pie in the sky, and there's nothing firm here at all.
Well, and none of it's really costed, I guess, Sabrina, and that's the other side of this issue. But quite frankly, the last platform wasn't costed, didn't hurt them at all.
I think, yeah, absolutely. For me, I was kind of like, where's like the money? Like, show us the money here. This isn't like it's a very lofty, ambitious transit plan. A lot of things that, I think the city's voters would be happy about. But you're right, it's not fully costed, $82 billion, but that doesn't really cover a lot of the questions here. And so I think that doesn't really matter, though, to a voter if you're sitting in traffic and the Ford government is up there saying, we can save you 30 minutes. I don't know how closely people are looking at the policy behind this, but I think that kind of happens around election time, especially with infrastructure announcements too. Like transit kind of needs a little more than 4-year planning as it is. So I think these are ambitious plans. And I think a lot of people have the vibe that if anyone can do it, the Ford government can do it. But also transit is kind of like a pet project for Doug Ford. It's one of his favorite files. And obviously it allows a lot of ribbon cutting, a lot of splashy announcements. And this is probably going to be pretty appealing for the electorate. I don't know if it's enough to bring people to the polls or not. I guess we'll find out about that one.
Well, I put it to you, John, just because you got the sort of the finger on the pulse in terms of people getting back to work. I don't know that we've taken into account the shift in the work culture vis-a-vis the transportation needs. I'm not suggesting we don't need rapid transit. I think perhaps we might need more of it, considering, somebody who lives in Oshawa might be working in Mississauga. Well, you're going to want that transit line to go right through from Durham out to Peel. So that's probably not a bad thing. But the degree to which we're taking into account the shift in the workplace culture, how often I go to the office, to me, it is missing in this plan and in this transportation discussion.
Remember the first time we talked about the 413, we talked about the need to lay down these plans for the future, because when the future arrives, oftentimes these things are not built. You look at the 401 that goes across the top of Toronto. It was, I don't know if it can be expanded any further, but remember, about every 3 or 4 years, they would get an expansion of a lane finished, and then they would have to start again. It would just go on. It was kind of like, well, why didn't you just build it that way whenever you could? So the first thing is that this city, regardless of whether we're working from home now or whatever, is going to continue to expand. And as a result, it needs an infrastructure which we so dearly are concerned about today that does not exist. And we wish, if City Hall had got its act together, or the province, at least this is, in our own mindset, something that's going to be done over the next 10 years. Secondly, it's smart politics. To coddle together all of these things and say, over the next number of years, we're going to spend this. At least it's a plan and a plank and a number they can go to. And as I said, it's smart politics. You added together all the money that you're expected to spend in long-term care homes over the next years. Anyways, you'd also have a big number. And so you could say, we're investing in tomorrow, and over the next 10 years, we're going to do this. So, that's the politics of getting ready for an election campaign, whether it works or not, or there at the time, or whatever. So, but the third thing is, to your point, Dave, there's a turning point that's happened in our society in terms of whether or not we're going to be getting in cars and we're going to be driving anywhere anytime soon in big numbers. I had a great conversation with somebody who's a very senior executive at a company last weekend. We were off to see some friends, and they happened to be there. And I said, and she was talking about the fact that going back to the office nowadays at her very large company that we would know by name easily, her entire division gets to go in 1 day a week and do absolutely nothing. It's basically just come on in and sit and bring your stories about your kids and get back together and stuff like that. And you kind of say, well, what's the point of that? And you say, well, it's about a culturalization. There are people in Maru, for instance, that were hired a year ago that have not met any more than 4 people. There's a whole culturalization that's going to take place. And so it may be that we're not using those highways, or, even with the price of gas, wanting to work from home more often. But I suspect it's more for the long term and getting ready for something that's not just a decade down the road, but 20 years down the road, in terms of where, that'll hit the road then.
Can we just talk about, I think it was under the radar, but the CTV and Patrick Brown agreement I guess they've come to terms, Keith, over what appeared to have been a fatal blow to Mayor Brown's political future. I mean, let's face it, whether you agreed with the story or not, whether you agreed that CTV was wrong or right, or however they handled the story, it didn't matter. The fact was he lost his gig as the leader of the Conservative Party in this province, was on track to be premier. They've settled that. And I wonder, what that does, or if that, I don't want to say emboldened, if that strengthens or hardens Patrick Brown's resolve in terms of getting involved in the federal leadership race, all of those sorts of things. It just kind of coincidentally happens as all of these other things are swirling around.
I don't think there's a coincidence here at all to the settlement of this. But talking about the timing and the 4-year anniversary of the Ford winning the leadership, of course, Patrick Brown would absolutely have been the Premier of Ontario. The next Conservative, whoever became the Conservative leader, and he was at the time, there wasn't a leadership race planned until that story came out. Now, the story itself raised a lot of eyebrows. It was at the height of the Me Too movement. And Brown was basically cut loose at 11 o'clock at night by the Conservative caucus. His staff abandoned him. He was just left dangling in the woods. And as you recall, he then decided he was going to run for chairman of the region. And so the Premier Ford told we won't have a regional government and we won't have an election for that. We'll appoint it. Well, then I'll run for mayor of Brandon. And of course, he won because he's an incredible organizer and has a real ability to sell memberships in a political party, which is how he became PC leader in Ontario in the first place when he was a virtual unknown at Queen's Park. So to the settlement itself, he sued CTV for, I believe it was $6 or $8 million. No money changed hands. In fact, the CTV story is still up, but it has corrected the age of one of the accused from 18 to 19. And this is the end of the story. That's it. There's no money. They've settled. The lawsuits are over. And this does indeed clear the way, I guess, in his mind, for Mr. Brown to run for the federal Conservative leadership. And he's going to announce that this weekend. Interesting point, has nothing to do with that lawsuit, but a reporter in Alberta posted, and I thought this was really interesting, from 1999, the PC Party youth president, Patrick Brown, who was a diehard Jean Chrétien supporter, was in a big public fight with the University of Calgary Conservative Club president Pierre Poilievre over uniting with the Reform Party. So if you want to be prime minister, kids, get in the campus conservative clubs or the campus liberal clubs early on and just stick with it.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. He was on, I heard him talking to John Moore this week, and he actually brought up how in the day he and Poilievre were, fast friends, and they were arguing and debating as should be. So he was welcoming the thrust and parry. But to that extent, last week, John, we had Mayor Lehman on from Barrie. We've got Doug Ford, who was a former, city councillor in Toronto. To me, it's beginning to reinforce the need to be focusing on the cities, on the municipalities, particularly in the recovery and, in your phrase, the reckoning that comes with COVID. It's going to happen at the ground level. So the higher levels of government really are going to have to be focusing on that.
Yes, and we haven't heard much yet in terms of how the money could be given to the municipalities. At least I haven't heard it. Have anybody on this line? Sabrina? I mean, I haven't heard anything at all. If in fact anything happened in this past week, the government was accused of underspending the money it had been given. $5.5 billion bucks left off the table. So, I mean, maybe that's the harvest that they'll spread going into the election campaign to the municipalities. Look, at the end of the day, the cities remain the most important fixture for all of our lives, and yet the elected politicians oftentimes are not given the most scrutiny. I mean, that's the reality. We hold the federal and provincial folks far more accountable than we do our local council people who make the decisions that affect our lives the most with property taxes and things like that. Having said that, it really is going to be a significant transformation over the next many months. And I still don't think we know what the issue is going to be in this upcoming campaign. But cities, by the time that campaign comes about, will start to be transitioning back to some kind of new normal. And those costs in the system for all the things that were there during the pandemic that have to be dealt with. That'll be on the agenda then too. So, it remains to be seen. But these cities are the most important part of our lives, and yet we oftentimes, as I said, focus on other levels of government and hold them accountable far more about what should be done.
Well, and by accident or design, Sabrina, it's worth noting that this is also an election year for municipalities in Ontario. So it's going to come up in the fall, a few short months later, which is kind of all part of the calculus too around Patrick Brown. He could actually lose the leadership race for the feds and still run for mayor of Brampton. But I mean, that's a side issue. But I begin to wonder, and if you're getting any sense of how that background of the municipal elections is actually going to influence or inform what we might see in the provincial campaign.
Well, I think it's already had an impact just because of the timing of it. And like, I don't know, I guess I'm just stuck on this timing theme today, but you're right. Patrick Brown, he could lose the federal Conservative leadership, run again for mayor, but also I'm kind of waiting to see if any other Ontario politicians come out of the woodwork here, because the timing would also work that you either bow out or you lose your seat in June, and then maybe you want to make a municipal bid in October. I guess Roman Baber has decided he's throwing his hat in the federal ring too. I don't know how much of a mark he'll make on that, but for sure, he is likely, a lot less likely to be running provincially now. So there's a bit of an opening there. And I think that the incumbents have a leg up. So we've already got Jane McKenna in Burlington from the Conservatives saying that she won't run again. She's going to run for a regional seat. So she's just switching political levels there. But you're right. And to John's point that, municipalities are creatures of the province. And obviously when it comes to their big files, especially transit, that they're going to be looking to the province, to help get them out. The TTC has like an operating cost like shortfall, like 180 million. So it's just like that's going to have to come from help. Help is going to have to come from the provinces and the feds. And so obviously with the province, having an election a few months before, they're going to be making all these big promises to municipalities, and that's going to have an impact on the October elections. Absolutely.
Well, and we leave that hanging out there, Keith, because that can be one of those things where the government can appear to be magnanimous. They really don't have much choice. They're going to have to bail out some of these municipalities before this election, because we look at the budget cycle for the province stretched out as far as it is. That's one thing. And I think there's almost some political jeopardy there for them on both counts. Either you have left them out hanging out to dry, or you're overspending at a time when we don't have the cash to spend.
Well, they've got some cash to spend. First of all, as John pointed out, the FAO noted there was $5.5 billion underspent so far. I think part of the calculations when the premier is under pressure to cut the gasoline tax because of the soaring prices is that gas tax revenue for the province is shared directly with the municipalities. And it is a huge check that they really count on every year. Now, as for the COVID costs and part of the underspending was on community and social services, $2.5 billion of it, apparently. That a lot of those programs are administered again directly by the municipalities. They're going to have to be made whole. This government is going to have to do some fine maneuvering in its budget, which is, going to come just before the election. It's going to be the election platform. At least that will be costed out. A budget has to be costed out. So we're going to see in there, will there be rescue for everyone who needs it? Will there be enough to make municipalities whole? Will there be special compensation for Ottawa for what it went through with the occupation? There's all sorts of questions. And again, will they get the funding up for the autism program? Will they get all these other funding? The budget is going to be the key. And as we know, they've positioned this budget to be their election platform. And it's going to come basically at the very start of the campaign. Very interesting times to watch, but the municipalities need some cash.
So I just, to your point around the gas, in this part of the world, the gas went down 15 cents overnight. That was unheard of. So we're traveling this weekend. I thought I better go and fill up. I went this morning. It was still $1.76 a liter, by the way, with the 15-cent drop. But I've decided I'm going to keep my receipt just as a memento, because the as of Tuesday, we're getting into the hybrid. We've just figured out I'm getting rid of the fully gasoline-driven vehicles. So that's our effort to kind of deal with it. But those are the things, John, that we didn't expect. We weren't talking about $2 a liter gasoline. How does that play into this, election cycle for the province? So those are some of the variables that I think they're going to come up.
Look, there's something really critical in the polling that some of my industry colleagues are seeing as well, and it plays into what we've talked about before, but I'll put a sharp edge to this. There is a group of people in our society, roughly 40% of people, who have been completely disconnected from what's going on. There are young people. There are people who have oftentimes hourly wages. They're not the professionals. They can't afford a house. They have been dependent upon jobs which oftentimes keep them in rental apartments in certain parts of cities, or that they have to drive a distance to it and come back, and they have to live on an hourly wage, oftentimes without benefits. There is a core of young people in this country who sided with the anger of those people who were protesting with those big rigs. Parse what I said, sided with the anger of that going on. I'm seeing it in the data. It goes back to what I said last week. I don't know where that's going. But I do know that group of people do not have a voice. And I do know that, whoever channels that voice, there's a lot to be said for municipalities and how they are living their life. But it's not about the lawyers and the doctors and the professionals who earn, who even on the OSAP side, you can make that money back over your lifetime and pay off your student debt, whatever it is. But there's a lot of young people who can't. And I think there's a reckoning coming on that side, Dave. We're producing jobs. I mean, this morning it's basically said that Canada produced 337,000 jobs. Well, you know what? There's a lot of young people who may be getting work in that, but they're oftentimes the ones who are marginalized, and they're not earning a significant amount. So the gas price this week, my goodness, $30 out of my pocket doesn't mean a whole lot. $30 out of some young person's pocket, that can be an hour and a half of their wage. And that's just for maybe, 2 or 3 days. These are really important issues for that group of people. And I think maybe that's where the province should be spending some of its time and its capital, is to look after that group.
Yeah, Sabrina, I heard somebody talking about this earlier in the week, and the gas prices were on their way up. And in fact, there was consideration in one household where one of the partners in the family decided that maybe it wasn't worth driving to work. I was going to give up the job because we can't afford the gas to get to and from. This is becoming real for people. And I know there's a conversation and a push out there for the premier to drop the tax on gas. And if he does that, the municipalities lose, for one thing. But the second part of that is if he says, oh, no, we got to keep this money, at some point then it bites him in the rear end when he starts talking about dropping tolls and not having $1 billion in license fees. So there's some jeopardy here.
Yeah, I think the difference is, especially from 2018, is that nobody really wants austerity measures right now. That especially as we're coming out of COVID, people are kind of okay with the government spending, especially as affordability is reaching a crisis point for a lot of people, as John was saying. I think that there's obviously, especially with the gas prices, there's so many factors at play here. But because the Ford government is staring down potential re-election, they're going to have to at least get creative and at least, help people because it's becoming, unbearable for a lot of people. I think we talked last time about the NDP's proposal to regulate gas prices by empowering the Ontario Energy Board to set prices every week. And I don't think that will really do anything, from the experts that we've talked to. That will probably just create this next level of bureaucracy. And the Ford government now, especially the premier in 2018, he had promised 5.7 cents off a liter. And, again, we didn't really have a costed platform, the how of all of that. And you can kind of hear his language has changed a bit too. He's saying that's something we'll look into. But I think that there's no doubt that pocketbook issues are going to be front and center during this campaign. And the price of gas is probably going to get worse before it gets better. Yeah, we had this rare drop. I think that's probably why there were long lines out there. So I think that people are going to be looking to the governments to help out in some way here.
He's also vulnerable on the promise of a 12% electricity rate cut. And they've changed their language on that too. Well, it's now going to be 12% less in 2025 than what it would have been under the Liberals if the Liberals had kept going with blah, 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 blah. In other words, you're not getting that 12%, which is something. And as for the NDP's idea of regulated prices, I know I crapped on this last week. I'm going to do it again because I discovered something this week in regulated Nova Scotia where once a week they set the prices. They have a thing called an interrupter clause that they used 3 times in 72 hours to raise the price. So even though it's normally set once a week and that stops the wild swing, well, it doesn't. They have the interrupter clause. So I would not recommend Ontario go down to regulated price because, as Sabrina pointed out, bigger bureaucracy, and it's not going to solve you from soaring gas prices.
And the last thing I'd say to all of this, and to frame the next time we get together, is that the political numbers that are coming out this week, I have approval rating numbers that will be released early next week. So here's your preview. I mean, the Premier is sitting at 37% approval rating, which is down 3 points. The vote numbers that Léger has put out and others have put out have the government at 37% of committed vote. The NDP and the Liberals tied in the high 20s. I mean, if you went to the polls today, that's a whacking big majority. No question about it. He would win very big. However, we're not into that campaign. And if what you look for in numbers like this, it's the best way to describe it is that if you've got an approval rating which exceeds your vote numbers, it helps you grow into more of what is a potential vote. And what that means right now is that he can't grow anymore at the moment. And so everything that's notched down is really taken off the bottom line. So, we're heading into the stretch with a budget to come. We're right in the window for that campaign. They've got a majority government that's theirs to lose, and we'll see where it goes. But right now, they're well positioned for that majority government.
Well, it'll be a fun ride between now and June the 2nd, and we'll be there with y'all as we watch what unfolds at Queen's Park. That'll do it for this week. It's On the Ledge, the Ontario Politics Podcast. Thanks for joining us and making us part of your audio on-demand routine. Thanks to Keith Leslie, John Wright, Sabrina and Angie from the Queen's Park Observer. On the Ledge is produced through Story Studio Network by Eye Contact Productions. Have a great weekend.